Welcome everyone back from the break. Hopefully you guys all had a restful break, got a stretch, and got some great tips on the Marca Prosecco. Hopefully you also have a cup of coffee in hand because I'm really excited to introduce you all to our professional panel. We've got three amazing women with us today who are going to talk to us about some both timely and timeless advice on how to navigate our careers. So first, I'd love to introduce our panel. First panelist that we have is Andrea Varnado. She is one of the youngest executive board members, and she's the head of strategy at Macy's. She also led one of the largest mergers and acquisitions at Williams-Sonoma, and she also claims to bake one of the best pound cakes ever. So, Andrea, I wish that we could have some of that today. That would be fun, but thank you for being with us today. Next, we also have Lee Mayer, who is the CEO of Havenly. Lee made a lot of major career choices in her life, and right now she heads up an interior design company based in Denver, Colorado, and has launched several private label home decor lines. She also has a Yorkie poo named Ruth Bader Ginspark, which is very sweet. And Lee, we're excited to have you share your knowledge on our panel today as well. And then lastly, we have Grace Atwood. Grace started her career corporately working at Bobble Bar before she transitioned to launch one of the most popular lifestyle blogs called The Stripe. And she also has a podcast called Bad on Paper, where she talks about books and a lot of curating your editorial lifestyle. She's also interviewed many celebrities and guests, and we're excited to have her share her knowledge on how to pivot a corporate career into one where you're becoming your own boss. So thank you, Grace, for joining us. Awesome. So ladies, I'd love to get started and talk about the obvious question that we have on mind right now, which is, this is a very trying time for us corporately right now. And overcoming challenge is just something that's very necessary for us and something that we have to do to build our own resilience. And I'd love to start with you, Andrea, where we talk about you being an ambitious woman. And I love how you just own the fact that you are an ambitious woman and you're not afraid to rise up to any challenge. And when I think about who we're asked to be as women, we're always asked to be courageous leaders at work. So as an unapologetic, ambitious woman, how do you overcome this idea of imposter syndrome and continue to find your voice to speak up and overcome challenges?
Thank you for the question. When I think about imposter syndrome, if I'm being honest with this group, it still comes up. Every time I think I'm over one situation or challenge, there's something else that comes up. And I think there's so much opportunity to lean into what you have. Sometimes it's helpful to just write down the things that you've done, the things that you know, where you know your level of expertise is, and then continue to grow. One of the things that I find is that as we're progressing in our careers, we want to do everything, we want to be everything, and that's certainly a great goal to have. But when you're building your confidence, it really lies into what you've done and what you have. And so when you're looking for, let's say, the courage to speak up in a meeting or to give a presentation, your foundation can always be the experience that you have. So if you know that you went to school and you specifically studied this, or you specifically worked on this area of the project, or you specifically did this research or data, stand up because you have more confidence in what's been done to support that. And then I find that that confidence then leans into areas where you might not have as much direct experience or expertise, but it helps give both yourself the credibility to stand up, but then also it helps to give even your audience the credibility to know that you are willing to do the work to support it. And so when I think about imposter syndrome connected to all of that, there's a balance of both confidence and humility. It's confidence in what you've done and what you know. And then one of the traits that I always look for in my team members is those that are willing to speak up for things, even if they don't know. And they'll usually caveat and say, we can do more research. I want to look more into this, but this is my hypothesis. And if you're able to give that leeway to say, there's more work to be done, here's my hypothesis, that helps to give you the interest to want to stand up and state your opinions more often. Because sometimes the worry with imposter syndrome is that we'll be found out. And that's really the risk there. So how can you help mitigate that?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you're right, taking stock of the confidence that you do have and remind yourself that you did study up to do these things, that you did prep yourself to do these things. I would love to get another take from one of our other panelists, either Lee or Grace. Does imposter syndrome show up for either of you guys? And how do you guys overcome that? Lee, maybe I'll start with you. Do you have strategies on how to overcome that? Because I fully agree with Andrea. I think it shows up a lot and it will continue to show up in our careers.
I think, I was like, I don't remember how old I was when I realized that everyone gets imposter syndrome. I thought it was like unique to me. Like my joke was on my first day of, some of the schools, for example, I went to, you're like sitting in an auditorium with 900 people. And I'm like sitting there being like, I was the admissions mistake. Like they let me in, and I'm like, oh no, they're going to find out about me, and then I realized that like 800 of the 900 people that are sitting there alongside me felt the same way. And I think honestly for me, actually what that did was it made it feel like it's a trick that everyone's brain plays on them, as opposed to something that was like unique to me because I was an imposter. And just like remembering that it's like everyone goes through this. This is a universal thing for almost all women and probably many men. And that was, I think, very helpful for me. I do agree. I think it's funny. I follow a wonderful influencer who shared a tip yesterday that I'm going to share with you because I think I'm going to do it, which is take screenshots or like pictures of all of the like nice notes and good things you've done, all of the praise you received, and just put it in a folder and call it "You're doing great, sweetie." And just like when you need a bump, because like my employees or my board members or whoever like send me nice notes every once in a while, and just like remembering like I've done good things, as well, and like, hey, even when I screw up, which I do, I can also do things well. And then there's like, again, there's a little bit of just owning it as well. I think there's a narrative. There was a narrative in my head around if I have imposter syndrome, like I'm not, there's something wrong with me or I'm not really qualified. There's this piece around owning that narrative and being like, I feel like I couldn't have done it and I still went and did it and that was good. And like owning the fact that like getting over this hesitancy because we don't feel like we're quite qualified enough is in and of itself a feat and an act that like makes me stronger or makes me better.
I love that. I think that's amazing. I think there's sometimes the internal narratives that we carry in our head. They're false stories. They're actually not real, right? And I think you guys both called out something so interesting, which was like, what if I get found out? What if they know that this isn't me or that I'm not capable of doing this? And I think just as women, it's so important for us to continue to lift ourselves up and celebrate the progress that we've made. Grace, I would love to get your perspective, not just because it sounds like we need a moment as women to give ourselves grace, literally, when we are trying to go after our dreams. What about you? Have you had any strategies that have worked for overcoming imposter syndrome? Or what's some of the talk that you do with yourself to try to manage it?
A constant dialogue I have with myself, like playing on what you guys have said is, everyone feels this way. It is so normal. I also know that I tend to dwell. If someone says something really nice to me, I'm like, oh, thank you so much. And then I'm on to the next thing. But if someone says something mean or makes me feel like I am not good at what I'm doing, I will hang on to that for years. So I think it's learning to let go of criticism. Yeah. And also there's like a little bit of faking it and psyching myself up. Like sometimes if I have a big meeting or something important, I'll think like, what would I do if I had like, sorry, we talked about this on my podcast before and we got some negative feedback for saying it, but like, what would I do if I was just like a rich white man? Like channeling that, like, white man confidence and setting aside all of those like internal doubts and fears. And like, you know, we've had to make some pretty big asks for guests on our podcast and things. And like my co-host and I just joke, we're going to just go channel our white man confidence. And it, we find that really helps. But, and I hate saying faking it, but it's also just like constantly checking yourself and what you're telling yourself and silencing that inner critic. And also sometimes just like faking a little confidence if you don't have it.
I think that those are such great tips. I like to say sometimes I like to channel my inner Beyonce. It's been known that before I go on stage, I literally play a Beyonce song, and I've done that with my VP before, and before I get on stage. So I love those tips because they're so practical. And I think one thing that you bring up, Grace, that is so important to stress is, I love when you said, find a way to let go of that criticism. Because sometimes that just sits so much with us, and you're right. Like, I think we've all done that. We get great compliments and you're like, thanks. And then when it comes to criticism, we pour on that. And I think one thing I definitely want to commit to doing as well for women is also to not pass that judgment that doesn't allow that criticism to happen, which is so important. So I love the answer on imposter syndrome, because it's really important to understand that, because that also helps us build our confidence, and it helps us build our confidence to make courageous decisions. So speaking of courageous decisions, I know that there's a couple I'd love to get to. Lee, I know you had to make a very courageous decision of completely pivoting your career, moving from the East Coast over to Denver. And it's a courageous decision to start your own company, get funding, and then also work with your family members on the business. So how did you find the courage and the confidence to make that jump, both professionally and personally? What tips do you have for women to find that courage? Because I think there's a lot of women probably online today who are thinking to themselves, do I make a move? Do I not make a move? And when is that okay? And how will I know?
So there are a couple of pieces to this question. I will share my story, which was maybe not as inspirational, but I think it might be. And the answer is, I'm a really risk-averse person. I had incredibly lucrative, high-paying jobs in New York, so ranging from finance to consulting. And I chose those jobs in large part because they were kind of not that risky. They paid high salaries and they were relatively assured, and I, did a fine job, I think. And the reality is, what actually tipped me over the edge, I think, is in New York. When I was living in New York, my whole group of friends had like similar jobs. I can't fully explain it. And so, first of all, the cost of living there is really high. And then there's kind of this like mainstream path that like, it feels like everyone in New York, particularly the ones that like went to school with me, followed. And so that was naturally kind of what I ended up sort of following. And it was actually the act of moving away from that city that I think freed me up to pursue potential different paths. And there are a couple of reasons for that. So the first is, I got out of that like finance bubble that I was living in New York. So, all of a sudden I'm in Denver, and like, there aren't any finance jobs here, first of all. And second of all, people do lots of different things here. It's not just finance and media, right? Like, people work in oil and gas, they are creatives. And so, there's a lot of like, I honestly credit that geographic change with an expansion of just my horizons. Another thing that kind of happened was the cost of living, and just like, the real tactical stuff that we think about, which is like, how am I going to pay my bills? Can I continue to maintain the lifestyle that I have, et cetera, when I like start my own company? The extremely high cost of living in a city like New York really prevents you from taking potential risks or positions that might, even in the short term, diminish your earning potential, even if it's like for long-term gain. And so I think that was actually another part of things where I got to a place where I felt like it was okay for me to not have a salary for a couple of years while I got things off the ground. And I think the third thing that kind of happened was a bunch of my friends from, in particular from the business school I went to, including, by the way, Amy and Daniela, who were my classmates who started Bubble, started companies, and there were a lot of them were women. And I started to be like, wow, like, they can do it. They're doing this. Like, maybe I should think about it too. However, I will be honest. I accidentally started this company. I will like I'm totally honest about this. I was looking for other jobs like the jobs that I had in New York, and I was looking in Denver. And it's a harder market to find those jobs because it's a smaller finance market, et cetera. And honestly, Denver at the time too was like one of those cities where like gray hair means a lot. Like think oil and gas and telecom. Like there's a little bit of this. I also like visibly look younger than I am. I'm 5'1". You probably can't tell. So I don't look like an experienced man. And so I was looking for other jobs here because the last company I was with had gone public and I'd left that. And so it was interesting. Like I kind of started this like, oh yeah, like it's an idea I had, let's like work on it. But I kind of thought about it as like, oh, this is something someone else should start. Like, you know, someone else should start, get funding for, et cetera. And so, you know, the idea of like online or virtual interior design was like something I was like, oh, some entrepreneur should really start this. So that was kind of my pitch. And I started to work on it. And then all of a sudden one day I woke up and I realized that all I was doing was spending time on this idea. And I was doing no time on, you know, either other jobs or consulting work or whatever else. And so it was sort of accidental. And I say this, the reason I say this is because sometimes the narrative around how people become entrepreneurs or start companies is like mythologized. Like there's this myth of like Mark's, you know, Apple, Steve Jobs wears turtlenecks and jeans and like wakes up with great ideas, right? Or like Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook, you know, like there's this like mythos that's out there. And the point is a lot of us come to entrepreneurship in a lot of different ways. And like for me, it wasn't a pursuit. It wasn't something I thought that I was ever going to do. I ended up here because I fell in love with the idea and a lot of the constraints that were pulling me in a different direction were removed. Some people do wake up with a genius idea. Some people, frankly, my little sister's one of them. Some people just always want to start companies and that's okay. And so, you know, allowing for this like slightly different narrative around entrepreneurship, I think is good for everyone.
Yeah. I love that, Lee. And I think what's amazing about your story is that your energy naturally went there. I love how you said that you ended up just noticing that most of your time was going there and you started that company. And I think you bring a great point. Entrepreneurship happens in so many different ways and so many different facets of our life. And we have to allow those different starts to come in, which I'd love to then pivot over to Grace. Speaking of knowing when you want to become your own boss, knowing when you want to become an entrepreneur, when your passions naturally start to take you there. How did you know and how did you trust yourself when you made the move from a corporate role at Bobble Bar to starting your own blog and then eventually starting your own podcast?
Yeah, so I want to back up a little bit because I didn't start my career at Bobble Bar. I wish I was that young. I worked for about 8 or 9 years before that. So I started out as an assistant buyer, and I got this opportunity to move to New York and work in the beauty industry. And I listened to like that little gut voice. Like I feel like as women, we have to do a good job at silencing our inner critic, but we also need to listen to that intuition and that really like powerful gut feeling that we can get, because that led me to New York. And then 5 or 6 years later, I got this opportunity to go to a startup. I still don't consider my experience at Bobble Bar to be corporate because it was such a scrappy startup, at least when I was there. It's definitely grown a lot since then. But there was that little voice again told me, you need to take this job, you need to jump on this opportunity. And so I think it's so important because your gut will tell you what you should do. And then you, of course, have to do the things to back up, like save your money. I really think there is so much freedom. Like I would, there was a time where I was really unhappy and I would spend, like, I'd be like, oh, I'll just treat myself to these shoes, or I'll treat myself to, you know, a fancy coffee to feel better, like all those little things and those treats. And it is good to treat yourself. But at the same time, like, what happened for me was I realized I wanted to take a chance on my own business, and saving money gave me that financial freedom. So if things were to go belly up or I couldn't pay myself, I'd be okay. And that was a big thing. But honestly, like if you want my candid answer, leaving Bobble Bar, I didn't want to leave. I got to a point where it was just one thing or the other had to go, because I was working 60 hours a week at Bottle Bar. I was running all of their social media and all their influencer programming. And then I was working another 30 or 40 hours on my own blog and my Instagram. And there was one weekend where I couldn't get out of bed. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I was like, I'm not sick. I don't have a cold. My whole body just felt like lead. And I felt like really just awful. And like, I think that could have been some depression now that like I look back and I have like clarity, but I think I was also just so incredibly burnt out that I realized I couldn't do both anymore. Like I had so much of my identity was swept up in having this long-term career. You know, I worked for Cody, I worked for Procter & Gamble, I worked at Bottle Bar. I accomplished so much while I was at Bottle Bar, and it was so scary to like leave that identity behind and be like, oh, when people ask you what you do, like, oh, I have a blog. Like that just felt so cringy and like embarrassing to me. So I had to like get over that in my head. Again, the imposter syndrome kicking in, and also just take a chance on myself, because was I going to go work for myself where working harder meant, you know, more money in my pocket and building something I really believed in, or working for someone else and helping someone else's dreams come true? So I ended up talking to my bosses, Amy and Daniela, and going down to a few days a week at first. And I kind of tried it out, and then that gave me the confidence to ultimately leave full time. But it was really scary. I didn't want to do it, but I got to the point where I wasn't physically taking care of myself because I was just completely burnt out.
Yeah, thank you for those responses, Grace. And first of all, I also just wanted to say thank you for sharing your vulnerability. The story that you just went through, I know that this is a story that probably a lot of women online today have faced as well. So I really appreciate you sharing that candidly and showing your resilience through that story, which is really incredible and really amazing. So thank you for that. Ladies, I'm loving these responses, and I'd love to pivot to the next theme that we'd love to talk about, which is support and mentorship. Because with everything that you guys have talked about developing amazing careers, jumping into entrepreneurship, overcoming imposter syndrome, and finding that confidence, that also comes with a strong network of women supporting each other and mentorship. So I'd love to go to Anddria. When we think about mentorship and you think about the value of mentorship today, how should women do networking and mentorship today? How can we show up as mentors, especially now that a lot of us are working in a virtual work environment, or we're not naturally having those mentor-mentee relationships, whether passing through a hallway at work, and obviously our ability to meet at coffee shops and talk has been limited as well. How should women navigate that today? And then I'll have a follow-up question for you there as well.
Sure. There are so many ways to think about it. And I will share possibly an unpopular opinion in that I think that we hold the concept of mentorship in a very archaic way. We think about it as, you have to be my mentor, you will be my mentor, we will meet once a month for the next 12 months. And it ends up feeling more like a burden. And then you get stressed about, what do I talk about, and things of this sort. And I think, especially in this environment, and if you take the flow of what Grace and Lee have just talked about around going with your gut and having these conversations, I think the great thing is in this environment, we can give ourselves the freedom to not be as formal. You don't have to be in a formal mentorship program, even though those are nice. You can just meet with someone once, and they don't have to be your mentor. You don't have to invite them. It's like marrying someone. You don't have to invite them to be this long-term partner. You can just have an informational one-on-one chat, and they don't have to formally be your mentor. You can derive the same mentorship concepts, themes, ask them the same questions without that formality. If they're open to it, that's great. But even for yourself, and I will share, because this group has been so vulnerable. I've had a number of mentors throughout my career, many that I'm still in touch with, but there's some where, frankly, we met, it was great, it was nice, but there was not chemistry and it just didn't go on. And I think being able to say, like, okay, that didn't work, move on, we had a great discussion, and staying in touch when you need it. And then I also think that we tend to want to be mentored by the formal, powerful, they've done these amazing things in our career, without acknowledging that I know for my friends, I have an amazing group of friends that are women that are successful, that even when I'm going through things, I can have a conversation. I had a conversation at 8:30 this morning with one of my girlfriends where we were talking about our jobs. And one of the pieces she gave me was, she said, Anddria, have you asked yourself why and what you're meant to learn in this process? A little bit of therapy involved in there. But at the same time, I think that we can look to not just those who are more senior than us, but we could look to those around us, around mentorship and being vulnerable. And sometimes it's probably easier to share even with your friends, if something stressful happens with your boss or your project, and just say, I'd love to get your opinion on this. We don't always have to talk about whatever we talk about, Netflix movies, which is also important. But I think just inviting our friends and thinking about mentors in this much broader concept is something that we can do, especially in this virtual environment. Invite someone to, hey, I really like what you've done at the company. I'm interested in learning more about your division. Can we chat for 30 minutes? I'd love to have a happy hour or coffee chat with you. And so you can do that starting tomorrow. And so a lot of times when I meet with people, I challenge them to say, in the next 2 weeks, just reach out to 3 people, whether they work at your company, whether they're your friends, whether they're friends of friends, and just ask to meet for a few minutes.
Awesome, Andrea. I think that's such a great way of looking at it. And something you said just made me write something down. It's so important to find the right mentors for the right moments. Mm-hmm. And it's okay to have multiple mentors. And every moment can be a mentor moment, depending on what you need to learn, and also how we mentor and how we show up for other people in our network as well. So I love that you say that. As a follow-up to that, knowing that we are navigating a lot of social justice issues today and have been for some time. And for you being a Black woman in a major corporation, how have you faced challenges as a Black woman in a corporation, and how have others mentored you, or how have you mentored others who have faced similar challenges during those circumstances?
It's like most of the things that we've talked about today as tough topics. It has been an evolution. I would say when I started out in corporate America, I did not want to be different. I wanted to fit in, and I didn't want to, not necessarily, I didn't want to acknowledge that I was a Black woman. I just didn't want to be different. I want to be treated like everyone else. But I think as we've seen from even some of the other panelists on this conversation, it's those differences that shine through. And so really being willing to, I know for me, especially as of recently, being able to share my experience as a Black woman, and I can share part of it on this conversation, is coming in, not wanting to feel different, always feeling like I'm being looked at as different. We can have a whole conversation about hair, but I will suffice it to say, sometimes I wear my hair straight. If you look at pictures of me, you'll see most of it straight. Sometimes it's curly when I go into the office, and I'm always wondering, how are people reacting to that? I'm thinking more about what my hair looks like or how I'm perceived, if I'm representing my entire culture, which I don't, how that is perceived. And there are a couple of ways I've been able to deal with it. And I think this goes for both sides. One, I have personally been more comfortable talking about it. When someone comments on my hair when it's curly and they say like, oh, it's shorter, I explain, actually, no, it's not shorter. It's curly, didn't cut it. It'll be straight again tomorrow. Who knows what it'll look like? But I've also appreciated those that have been willing to have the conversation. And while this doesn't work for everyone, those who do not look like me, when they invite me into the conversation, or when they want to have a one-on-one chat just to get to know me, or if they realize like, hey, Anddria wasn't invited to this happy hour, Anddria wasn't there, we should bring her into the conversation. Those are things that I have appreciated. And then on my own, just as a woman of color, I think we have been able to connect on these stories. And so it's not, while there are a number of bullet points that I could share about what companies should do and how they should do it, and trust me, I have those ready to go. At the same time, I find the most impactful piece is sharing my personal stories and my experiences, because I do find that we can connect with those. Most people can at some point in their lives recall feeling different. whether it's kindergarten, whether it's 2 weeks ago, not being the last person picked for the dodgeball team or whatever it is, we can recall those moments of feeling like, oh, am I part of this? And so if you just go back to that and think, how do I bring others into the conversation? I do the same, and I'm willing to share, and I invite others to be willing to have some of these really tough conversations.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that perspective, Andrea. I think it's so important. And you bring up another great point of how important community is and how we've got to support each other and make each other feel a part of the community. Lee, I'd love to ask you the same question from a mentorship perspective. How have you supported others with mentorship, and how have you gone about seeking mentors in your life, especially as an entrepreneur now?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Andrea said. I do think that like sometimes I have a couple of challenges with this conversation. And so the first is the one that was just brought up, which is like, it doesn't have to be formal. In fact, sometimes it's better if relationships form organically and a little more naturally, and you sort of maintain a cadence that makes a little bit more sense in the context of your life. The other thing I actually have noticed is, I just want to be clear, don't only look for female mentors. Men are an incredible, if you're trying to succeed in business, men are incredibly, unfortunately, overrepresented part of the power structure. And by excluding men from, you know, their obligation to promote you and mentor you and help you, you are excluding them from doing the things that we need them to do for communities, for the female community and for communities of people of color. And so, like, you know, by and large, the mentors that I have largely are men. The people that I have advocating on my behalf, that are helping me fundraise, that are on my board, that have been advisors to me, are men, and they've been incredibly powerful at men. And they've been just as delighted to participate. And by the way, they want to be a part of this conversation. And this is, I honestly, apart from this and a couple of other things, I don't tend to participate in female-only events anymore, because I'm like, we're talking to ourselves, you guys. We need to bring in all of the other people to help us create more gender and racial equality in business. And we're not going to do that by excluding white men. And so I do think that that's like, you know, another important thing that I would say, like women are amazing, and they're incredible women that can sort of empathize and tell you how they've navigated their own careers. But don't forget that there are plenty of amazing men, white, Caucasian, cisgender, heterosexual, whatever it is, majority feeling folks that can also help you. And in fact, are looking for ways, as they become more and more aware of sort of the equalities as has been done over the last month or two, they're looking for ways to do it. And so use that to your advantage, and make sure to bring that in and share your experiences with them as well. I think the third thing, and I say this kind of tongue in cheek, I talk to a lot of young entrepreneurs, and I tell them the following. I say, you will get a mentor or someone who's gone through it before, and they're going to tell you a smart thing, and then you're not going to listen to it. Why? Because honestly, sometimes you just need to learn it on your own. And so one of the things that I always say is, mentors can tell you, friends can support you. And so when you inevitably make that stupid mistake that you didn't listen to your mentor or the advice, and you make the stupid mistake and you fall flat on your face or something bad happens, having a community that's alongside of you, that you feel comfortable and open with, where you could be like, oh man, I screwed up. I screwed up big. I should have listened to whoever. And just like have them be at a place where you can be vulnerable, and they can also share their own sets of failures, I think is incredibly helpful for mental health. Sometimes the trick with mentors is like, they feel so far advanced, and so you get double imposter syndrome. And so like, you know, and so having people that are kind of like where you are, where you feel comfortable and feel like you have sort of open conversations, because inevitably, if you try, sometimes you might fail. And that has to be okay. And you have to have a good place to go with that as well.
That's awesome perspective, Lee. And I think another great reminder that mentorship can come from anyone, anywhere, and such a great perspective that you're sharing with us today. Grace, in terms of mentorship and building a network, especially when you made your transition, and that was a big transition, how did you seek out support? How did you build your community to help you manage that transition?
think that in the earlier days of blogging, like there were so few of us doing it that we were all just like sharing everything we were up to. We openly talked about money, talked about things like a manager or things like that. So I was so lucky to have a great group of girlfriends that would tell me everything that I needed to know. And I would do the same for them. And, you know, we always would support each other and promote each other's projects and what have you. So I think what Andrea said really I identified with a lot, in that it's been like peers and peers helping peers.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that the age of social media might be so new that there isn't like some expert that's 20 years older than me that could help me with this. But, you know, somebody who maybe has more Instagram followers or a blog that has been around a little bit longer, that's like been invaluable for me.
Awesome. I think that's a great reminder. Thank you so much for all the candid and honest responses on the question of mentorship. I know that that's a topic that comes up a lot, especially during the times that we live in right now. So what I'd love to pivot to next is, obviously, for us to thrive in our professional lives, we also need to have that inspiration that keeps us going. And so I'd love to talk about what keeps you guys inspired. And Grace, I would actually love to start with you. Given the fact that you went from blog to podcast and you're constantly creating content, what are things that you're doing to help keep yourself professionally inspired as you're thinking about content for all of your followers and your audience?
I think it's just making sure that I'm consuming just as much as I'm putting out, because I feel like I'm always just reading tons and tons of different, whether it's other websites or different magazines and things. You know, just like I used to get so much inspiration just walking around New York. Things are slightly different now.
Yes.
And also listening to other podcasts and just always kind of being out there and seeing kind of what's going on. I also just write things down constantly. I have like 10 different notebooks. The notepad feature on my phone is my best friend. Like there will be just like so many things. And just planning, because I plan my blog content out probably like I know what I'm going to be writing for the next month, and like I try and have at least a week's worth of content written, so that I'm never like the night before struggling to figure out what's going to go on the blog the next day. And then for the podcast, we have to plan far out because we're always interviewing guests and bringing people on. So it's really important to just, I think, plan a lot, but to get inspired, just to make sure that I'm not just pushing stuff out and that I'm spending time looking at what's going on. And also I get so much inspiration just listening to I guess for someone in a more traditional business, like listening to my customer, which is my Instagram followers and my readers, like I answer every single DM, or at least read them all. So I have a really good pulse of what my consumer wants. And that's a really big one. Just spending time talking to your customers will really give you a lot of inspiration.
That's awesome. Thank you, Grace. And Lee, when we talk about inspiration for our homes, I know that you said you got into this business accidentally. As you've been working at Havenly and running Havenly, what tips and advice would you have for women to bring inspiration into their homes, especially since a lot of us are working from home right now?
Yes, and there's a service for that, for sure, if you ever need tips and tricks. So, you know, truth is, I'm not a designer. I started this company as the ultimate consumer, and I really resonate with what Grace just said, which is like having that point of view as I started this business. I am not a designer. It was literally like I needed the service myself, but having that direct through line to being like, I am the customer, I have a good feeling for what the customer needs, is a great place. Again, for us to sort of think about how we run our business, what we produce, and what content we produce. In terms of home inspiration, I think, you know, there are lots of ways to go about this, but I always say, you know, one of the things that I think where we've created a little bit of a brand for ourselves is the home space is actually one that's uniquely rarefied. Like, it's incredibly precious. Like, think about Architectural Digest. Like, where are the electrical cords in those photos? Like, we have electrical cords. They're not in those photos. And there are these like $1 million homes, and it's beautiful. It really is. But like, the reality is not all of us have, $2 million to drop on decor alone. May we all hopefully in the future, but like that's not really in the cards for many of us. And so one of the things I typically like to say is like ensure when you're thinking about just your home and your inspiration, or actually anywhere, remember that they've edited out the power chords. In other words, the reality of your home or your outfits or your weight or your hair is always a little bit like you're viewing something that's a little more glossy than it actually is. And so when you're thinking about your home, it's okay if it's a little messy somewhere. Put in some covered storage, right? It's okay that it's, your couch is like maybe not ultra modern, but it's like really comfortable. Make sure that whatever you're doing sort of reflects the reality of your life. And that goes for home and many other things.
That's awesome. And Lee, I will absolutely say your service is fantastic. It certainly makes interior design and the element of style accessible to so many women. And you're right, it's incredibly easy to use. And I love that consumer empathy is the ultimate inspiration for you, which is fantastic. So Andrea, like I would love to understand, especially from your unapologetic, ambitious woman point of view, how you stay inspired, keeping going at the office, making huge decisions, while also working alongside with a very ambitious partner as well. Managing that side by side is a lot. How do you stay inspired and keep both sides going? Or does sometimes one side win over the other? And if so, that's okay.
So believe it or not, even from a very corporate standpoint, I very much follow Grace's approach around, I am inspired and motivated by the things that are around me. I'm inspired by the ambitious goals I have for my personal life, my mansion with everything else that comes with it. I am, and then planning how to get there. I am inspired by just things and opportunities I see in business as an executive in the retail industry, always thinking about my customer. There's some things that I want that other customers don't. And then I'm really always intrigued when I hear different opinions about what customers want. I will say one of the examples is one of the popular items is like this washed cotton view. And so it's so funny. I remember seeing it and be like, oh, it looks like it's been washed. I don't want that. I want my things to look new. But there are a lot of people that really want washed cotton. And so being just open to the idea that while every perspective is not mine, that doesn't make it less valuable. And then there are some that might not be, and mine might not be valuable. I might actually be in the minority. But that open-mindedness, that exploring of customer behavior, that exploring of how my teams operate. I really like the psychology that comes along with my business. And I think that's the driver for many of the things that I do in my career is the why. What is it that interests me? And moving forward, similar to how Lee started it and said she had an idea for a business and she just kind of naturally went there. Even in my career and some of the pivots that I did, I would love to be able to tell you, well, I planned this, this, and this, and I always had this 5-year, 10-year career goal, when really it sounded fun. I liked it. I wanted to do it. And, I probably did some preparation, but really just leaning into where I saw my energy going, because you're absolutely right. When it is a late night at the office and when you do have, inevitably some difficult team members to deal with, knowing why you're there and what personally drives you, and your answer doesn't have to look like mine or the person next to you. Something else can be driving, and being okay with that, just being okay with your own reason why. And then, as you mentioned, just background that Joyce knows is I met my husband when we were both applying to business school. And we ended up going long distance, going to 2 separate business schools and trying to figure out how it worked. And then now, if you think about both of our careers, being ambitious, going into corporate America, taking different titles and roles, there is I wouldn't even call it a tug, but there is a balance sometimes, especially when we've had to think about, okay, you have this really great job opportunity that you love, but it's across the country. That means my job and my life has to change. And it hasn't always been a perfect or easy discussion, but I think going back to the why are we doing this, and then having a really healthy respect. I think we have always had, he knows my why, he knows what it is I want to do, he knows about the things that excites me. And so I've been really fortunate where I've had a partner that has at one time said, you know what, this is your dream job, this is what you talked about, so let's do it. And so I think it's having for both of us this ability to have this awareness of yeah, it sucks. I might have to give this up or that up, but am I really tied to this? Am I going to do this for the next 2 or 3 years anyway? And so just being willing to have some of that humility around where you really are, and then wanting your partner to be successful and vice versa.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great advice, Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, ladies, I'd love to move into the Q&A section. We've got some questions from our audience members, and we've got a lot of good ones. So this first question is actually for all of you. And so if you wouldn't mind answering quickly, your first thoughts that come to this question, and it's all around finding the silver linings. The question is, what good things have come out of this year for women? Or what good things do you hope women will discover out of this year, knowing how unusual it's been so far? So Lee, I'd love to start with you.
Good question. I think there are a couple of things. So first, one of the things that I've always been perplexed by is, first of all, in case you didn't know, even in two-party earner families, even in situations where the woman earns a lot more than the man, so the woman takes care of the lion's share of the home work, particularly when you have kids. And I've always thought it was something kind of funny where I kind of felt like I had to hide my life from work, in particular external partners, so male investors, all my investors male, board members, were it would be considered unprofessional if my kid was in the background of a video call, right? That is not the case anymore. By the way, my kid's almost always in the background of the video call. The only reason he isn't and they aren't is because I'm in my office today. But it's just sort of lowered this barrier, this whole weird thing where women had to you'd leave for a soccer game and you'd be like, oh, I have an appointment. You're leaving for a soccer game. Kids have soccer games. Go to the soccer game. But we felt like we needed to hide a lot of that. And I do think that openness around, we're also running lives. And in fact, women typically often are running more of the life part of our lives than men are. And I do really think that that openness, that we have a dog and a crazy mess and a kid in the background, has really sort of reduced some of the pressure around this dichotomy that women are sort of forced into. I think the other thing that I actually have thought has been interesting, and I don't think this is just unique to women, I think there's a lot of kindness in the world right now. I think there's this understanding that we're all going through a year. And yeah, there are good things that are coming out of the year. I would argue, in fact, a lot of the awareness around sort of racial justice and the strides we have yet to make on that side is a really good thing. So I do think that's a good thing to sort of come out of this, but it's still a hard thing. That's a hard thing for everyone. The pandemic's hard for everyone. Being at home is hard for everyone. The fact that I have to deal with my kids all day while I'm trying to work is a hard thing for everyone. And so there's a lot of understanding that we're going through a moment, and we're all going through a moment, and we're reacting to it in very different ways. And I'm just going to be a little bit nicer to my neighbor, because I don't know what they're going through today, but I've had some days, right? And I hope that that's actually something we can carry on beyond this moment. I hope that just understanding of humanity is something that we can go on. I think sometimes I worry about sort of the vitriol that's coming out of just the political process. Mm-hmm. And it feels like it's slipping away. All that goodwill we had, we can do this. You remember March, where we're we got this, that all of that's sort of slipping away, and it makes me a little sad. So I'm hoping that we can kind of hold on to the humanity of the moment as well.
Yeah. That's beautifully said, Lee. Thank you so much for sharing that. One thing that you hope everyone will take out of this year. Grace, what's the one thing that you hope everyone will take out of this year?
I think it's learning to slow down. I think I just put so much pressure on myself to be constantly out there and networking. And I realized I could do my job without a lot of that stuff. And I think I've gotten a lot healthier boundaries this year. And I think that a lot of people I know have, because when you're at home all day and you have to manage your time and you're seeing where it's all going, it just becomes so evident, all of the ways that we waste time. The other thing I will say, which not for me particularly, but I've seen it with a lot of friends, is creative projects. And this is, I'm sorry, it's speaking from the single and childless perspective, because we all don't have kids that we're teaching and homeschooling while doing our jobs, but we have a lot more time. And so in speaking to a lot of my friends who are single and stuck at home, like one of my male friends just started this amazing food blog. Another one of my girlfriends started a fiction romantic comedy podcast. There's so many cool things that people are doing with this time. And I think it's allowing people to be really creative.
That's awesome. Thank you for that, Grace. And that's a really, really great point. We've seen a lot of passion projects come out of this year as well. Andrea, what's the one good thing that you hope women will take away from this year?
I think just the opportunity to explore different things. I know some people, well, it feels like they have less time. Some people feel like they have more time. And so, I say getting to the bottom of that to-do list, those things that you never quite get to, but the fun stuff, the things you've been saying where I really wanted to explore this project or do this thing. I'm hoping that we lean into more just personal aspects. My personal view is that just as a society, we were prioritizing work more and more each year. And so I'm hoping that being at home, if you are flexible and able to work from home, you just have more opportunity to do the things that you really want to do so that when you are at work, you feel fulfilled. It is a part of your life, but it is not your life.
Yeah, that's great, Andrea. Thank you for sharing that. The next question that we have from one of our viewers is for Andrea. When you're working your way up in a company, what should you do if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you're not growing?
The quick answer in my head came to move, but that's not always an option. But I will say, when I go to jobs and if I've been in situations where it hasn't been comfortable, I always ask myself, what is it I want to learn from this situation until I can move or have another opportunity? And so if it's learning about a different area of the business, if it's increasing a certain skill, what can I do in my role? Can I meet with people to learn more about what they do? Because that might prepare me for the next thing. Can I spend time doing some of the online classes that maybe the company offers? And so I think about if I am challenged, what is it that I want to learn? And then what can I do about it in this moment, in this role, while preparing myself for the next thing?
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. The next question is for Grace. And Grace, I think this is a timely and timeless. What is an essential fashion staple for the working woman, especially when she's working from home right now? What's the one fashion piece that she should invest in?
I would say a house dress. That's what I'm wearing right now. It's like a big fat loose tent. It essentially is a nightgown, but it's Zoom call friendly.
I love that. That's so great. Do you have any recommendations of great ones? I think I need to add that to my list.
Yes, well, H&M has been great. That's where this one's from. Who else has good ones? J. Crew has some great caftans right now. And sometime this fall, I'm designing a second collection with Amazon. So buy that.
There you go. Well, no, obviously they can all go to your blog at the Stripe to go get some more fashion tips and advice. So that was it's a great question for levity right now. And Lee, the question that's coming in for you is, what did the process of securing funding look like for you? But most importantly, what's your biggest piece of advice for someone who's looking to gain funding for a current business?
Great question. The answer is it was hard. We raised $60 million for Havenly. And actually every subsequent round is a little bit different, but the hardest one is always your first round of capital because you typically don't have a business or business metrics to show. So you're really just selling yourself. So the whole thing feels incredibly personal. Every rejection feels really personal. I tell the story a lot, but I will repeat it here. For my seed round of funding, so just to give you context, like, my last round of funding, which is $30 million, closed really quickly. And it was, I effectively fundraised from one or two people. My first round of funding, which was $1.5 million, so a lot smaller, I had 140 no's before I got to my first yes. Wow. Think about that in any other context. Like, you ask 140 men or women out to prom and they say no. Or like you apply to 140 jobs and all of them say no. It's an incredibly demoralizing thing. And I think in a lot of ways, I started to conflate the rejection from people around the business concept with the rejection of me. Largely because that's kind of what you're selling. Like the first round, you're sort of going out there and you're being like, I can do this. Like, trust me, I can do this. And people are like, no, I don't think you can. And that's a difficult narrative. And there really is nothing other than appreciating that a lot of people go through that it's naturally a hard process, that maybe it should be hard for a 20-something-year-old without really any business metrics to raise millions of dollars. So maybe that's like why it's in the bit, like appreciate that it's set up that way, and it's okay. It actually it creates it helps you create focus around what you need to build and show to get the funding. It helps you start to really refine your storytelling and sales skills. And by the way, at the end of the day, before I got those 140 no's, I would say I was really timid around asking for things. Now I'm kind of like, yeah, you know, what's the worst that could happen? I've already like, I get 141 no's, you know, like, you know, it really does ultimately at the end of the day build a lot of confidence. But there's no two ways around it. It can be a tough process. What I typically will say in terms of how to secure funding, there are a few ways you can secure funding. So first, if you're really lucky. Second, if you're really well connected. Third, if you're a showstopper founder. Showstopper founders are people who have a pedigree and have exited companies really successfully before, or have a pedigree that's really paralleled. And then fourth, I think, you know, this is the one that I think most people will come to. Fourth is when you have data points that you can weave into a compelling narrative for why you and your company are going to succeed. And so I typically say, if you're not lucky, if you're not really well connected or rich, and if you aren't a showstopper founder, which most people aren't, do number 4, which is like, think about how to stitch together the story. What are the data points you need to stitch together the story? Go get those data points, practice the story a ton, and then you'll have at least something that people can kind of connect to with some supporting data. It's a bit like, you know, writing a novel. Like, you know, you sort of have to like bring that story together for people in a material way.
That's awesome, Lee. I think that's super helpful. And again, I think even hearing you have to go through so many no's to get to that yes is also a great lesson in resilience as well, which is a theme that we've talked about today in terms of how do we build that strength to keep going. So, well, ladies, I just want to say thank you so much. I think you guys offered some great advice, both timely and timeless, and a lot of really practical strategies and sage advice for a lot of our viewers today. And so I just wanted to take the time to thank you for joining me on this panel and talk about your professional journeys, recognizing they're still ongoing journeys. And I also just want to take this moment to celebrate you all in terms of how far you've come in your careers, and also take the time to celebrate you all for everything that you're doing and for sharing your wisdom. So with that, I would love if we can toast with a Marca Prosecco. I've got mine in front of me. My favorite way to enjoy is to with the little straw inside. It just makes it a little easier. So I just want to say cheers to you all. Cheers.
Cheers.
And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. I really appreciate it. I know all of our viewers really appreciate it. And so thank you to you all. For everyone watching, please go check out their blogs, check out their websites. There's more information on the everygirl.com. And moving next, we'll go over to Elena, who will talk about our giveaways and prizes as we close out the conference. So thank you, everyone.